It's somehow already week 11 of fantasy football, and we've reached the point of the year where every decision that you make matters. You don't want to start the wrong guy. You don't want to bench the wrong guy. Well, in this video, we're going to help you make those tough decisions because we are talking about wide receivers that you must start in week 11 of fantasy football. Breaking this video, as always, into 3 categories: your smash starts, your solid starts, and your high risk, high reward starts. 9 total players, 3 categories. We will be talking about 5 wide receiver sleepers that I love this week at the end of the video, so make sure you stay for that. Let's start with the high risk, high reward section. First guy up on the list is Khalil Shakir, who has been a rock solid target for Josh Allen all year long. No, he's not the flashy receiver. No, he's not the guy that maybe you get super excited to start in your lineup, but he's reliable and he's a guy that's quietly dangerous after the catch. We've already seen him score 50+ yard touchdown after a 5-yard reception. He can just take it to the house at any point. It's an underrated skill in his game that a lot of people don't talk about, but he's seen 7+ targets in each of his last 3 games. He's coming off a nice performance, 7 receptions, 58 yards on 9 targets, 12.8 fantasy points in week 10. And I think he's going to have a bigger role on this offense going forward. We saw last week against Miami, this Buffalo Bills offense was horrendous, and it just got even worse because they lost arguably their top target in the passing game for an extended period of time, talking about tight end Dalton Kincaid, who's going to be out for, who knows, 2 weeks, 4 weeks with a hamstring injury. Buffalo needs to feature Shakir on this offense, in this passing game. Like, they just have no one. They have James Cook on the ground, who's been sensational for the most part this year. But in the receiving game, it's like Keon Coleman is a bust at this point. Joshua Palmer is just a guy at this point. Elijah Moore, Curtis Samuel, like, they have no one. Yeah, maybe Dawson Knox steps up in Kincaid's absence, but why would they not utilize the guy that they just signed to a 4-year, $60 million contract this offseason? I think Khalil should absolutely be Allen's go-to target, not only this week, but for the foreseeable future. Like, just touching on Keon Coleman for a second, can you imagine that Bills front office, how they feel after they drafted Keon Coleman 1 pick ahead of Ladd McConkey, who's looking like a superstar receiver in the NFL right now? Like, they've just got to be kicking themselves. I know they wanted a bigger receiver, but Ladd is just light years better than Coleman is, who just, again, looks like a bust at this point, but that is for another day. It is worth noting that Khalil Shakir is dealing with a rib injury. He was limited in Wednesday's practice, so obviously monitor the practice reports. It sounds pretty minor. Buffalo is probably going to come out this week and go absolutely crazy on offense, and I want as many pieces as I possibly can get because Josh Allen doesn't have 2 bad games in a row, and the Tampa Bay Bucks aren't that great of a defense. I think this could be a high-scoring affair as well, and I think Shakir is a very nice flex play this week against the Bucks, who are allowing 34 PPR fantasy points to wide receivers this season. So if you need a guy to throw into your flex that has nice upside, I think Shakir could have one of his best games of the season in week 11. All right, moving on to our next guy, Troy Franklin, who's looking like the Broncos wide receiver 1 at this point. Like, he has been dominating Courtland Sutton since week 6. Franklin has more targets, catches, air yards, and fantasy points than Sutton, along with 4 touchdowns over his last 4 games, and has out-targeted Courtland 41-31 over that stretch. Franklin is playing really good football right now, some of the best of his young career, and he showed us his ceiling. We saw it in week 8 against the Dallas Cowboys. Granted, it was the Cowboys defense, but still, 6 receptions, 89 yards, 2 touchdowns, 26.9 fantasy points. Franklin is having a mini breakout this year. It's kind of flying under the radar, but he's looked really good, and a part of that has been opposing defenses are trying to take away Courtland Sutton, but it's leaving Franklin in a bunch of advantageous matchups, and I think that's likely going to continue in week 11 against the rested, really good Kansas City defense. We know the Chiefs are coming off a bye. The matchup overall obviously isn't ideal, as the Chiefs are allowing the second fewest fantasy points to wide receivers this season. But if you are in need of a flex, I think Franklin can come through for you this week. The Broncos are going to need to throw to someone, right? I do think the Chiefs are going to be able to score on this defense, which means the Broncos could be playing from behind most of the game, chasing points. And I think Franklin could see a ton of volume in this one and put together another strong performance. All right, moving on to our next guy, Jakobi Meyers, who should have scored a touchdown in his season debut as a Jaguar, but unfortunately, there was a false start on the play, so it didn't count. He did catch it. It was like a 3-yard touchdown that got called back. But either way, it was a fine debut for Meyers. All things considered, 3 catches, 41 yards on 3 targets, 7.1 fantasy points. He somehow led the team in receiving, which is kind of wild because that's not that great of production, but that's how bad this wide receiver room is. Parker Washington did have 2 touchdowns, but Meyers had more yards. And it is slightly impressive for Meyers considering he hasn't been on this team longer than a week before he played on Sunday, and he was not on the field that much. 50% route participation, but honestly, it would not shock me at all if Meyers is Trevor Lawrence's go-to target for the rest of the season. I'd expect his usage and volume to only increase, especially with Parker Washington popped up on the injury report with a hamstring injury. By the time you're watching this, maybe he's fine. It is Wednesday, so sometimes those practices don't really matter. Brian Thomas Jr. is nursing a high ankle sprain. He did return to practice, so maybe he's active. But either way, Meyers is going to have a huge role on this offense. And while the matchup isn't great as they get the Chargers in Week 11, but the Jaguars are probably going to have to throw the ball a lot if they want to beat this Chargers team. Meyers is going to be a big part of it. And if Washington and Brian Thomas Jr. are out, then he's going to be a very solid start. But for right now, we'll leave him in the high risk, high reward category. I do think he has nice flex appeal this week, and I think he's another guy that probably scores a touchdown. All right, let's move on to our solid starts. First guy up on the list is George Pickens, who hasn't had really any boom games since CeeDee Lamb returned from injury, but he's a guy that's been very consistent, double-digit fantasy points in every game but one this season, back-to-back weeks of earning 9+ targets, 20% target share on the year. It's nice to see considering most were worried that when Lamb came back that Pickens would just not see the football at all, but that hasn't really been the case. If anyone has kind of taken a little bit of a hit in terms of target volume, it's been tight end Jake Ferguson, but Pickens continues to ball out, continues to impress. It's evident he has a strong connection with Prescott and is on his way to a career year as he ranks second in the NFL in first downs at 42, third in touchdowns with 6, fourth in receiving yards at 764, fifth in yards per game at 84.9. This is a really good football player that was bogged down by a bad Pittsburgh Steelers offense, quarterback, play caller. I think George is going to have a monster game on Monday Night Football against the Raiders, who are allowing the 6th most fantasy points to receivers this season. And what's so great about Dallas is even though the Raiders are not a great offense, they can still put up points on the Cowboys because their defense is so bad, which is great for fantasy because that means they're going to continue to have to throw the football. That's why we love having as many Cowboys on our fantasy teams this year. And I would be planning on Pickens scoring a touchdown in Week 11, which would snap his 3-game drought without a touchdown. Pickens is set up to smash. He needs to be in your lineup. Feel really good about it. And I think he helps you win your matchup in Week 11. All right, moving on to our next guy, T. Higgins, who's another Bengals star on offense who's been absolutely saved since 40-year-old Joe Flacco took over as QB1. Who would have thought? What kind of world are we living in? But Flacco has been incredible. And T is the wide receiver 6 in fantasy, averaging 19.3 fantasy points per game since Week 6, since Flacco became the dude on this offense. And we know Higgins is coming off a monster performance in Week 9 before the Bengals had their bye. 7 receptions, 121 yards, 2 touchdowns, 33.1 fantasy points. And Flacco, we talked about him. He's been nothing short of incredible as he led the NFL in passing yards per game and touchdown passes from Week 6 to 9. Everyone on this offense has been eating. They'll continue to eat. I love Jamar Chase, obviously. Chase Brown is going to be great the second half of the year. T. Higgins. And I think Higgins does stay hot in Week 11 against the Steelers, who have allowed the most fantasy points per game and second most yards to receivers this season. And we've already seen Higgins beat the Steelers defense in Week 7. He had 6 receptions, 96 yards, and a touchdown, 21.6 fantasy points. And thank goodness we get a rematch of the Unk Bowl between Flacco and Rodgers. I think this matchup is going to be high scoring yet again, which is going to be great for fantasy for everyone involved. All right, moving on to our next guy, DeVonta Smith. As an A.J. Brown owner in several leagues, I don't understand I don't get it. What is happening in Philadelphia right now? Like, Brown was open on several plays on Monday Night Football against the Packers, wide open. Jalen Hurts doesn't even look towards him, doesn't even think about throwing his way. Like, Hurts legit hates Brown at this point. That's all I can think of. That's literally it, because why would you not throw to your best player, your best receiver? I don't get it. But with that being said, we got to move on, right? Smith is the new wide receiver 1 for the Eagles at this point. He's the only guy that Hurts really likes to throw the football to. And to be fair, DeVonta Smith, heck of a receiver. He looks like a top 10 receiver in the NFL right now. He deserves all the targets. He deserves all the love. Like, he's been exceptional. And over the last month of the season, since October 13th, DeVonta is 3rd in receiving yards per game at 112, behind only Jamar Chase and Jackson Smith-Njigba. And DeVonta is also coming off a nice game in Week 10 against the Packers, 4 receptions, 69 yards, touchdown on 7 targets, 16.9 fantasy points, and has scored 14 plus fantasy points in 4 out of his last 5 games. The Eagles are going to need all of Smitty that they can get on Sunday Night Football if they want to have a chance to keep up with the red-hot Detroit Lions offense. I do think that Smith has a big game against the beatable Lions secondary that ranks 27th against fantasy receivers this season. So start DeVonta. And in all seriousness, this is probably the game that A.J. Brown goes crazy, right? Because it's going to be high scoring. The Eagles are going to have to throw the football. A.J. Brown's been kind of complaining. He continues to kind of plead his case, which I'm totally on his side. It just feels like one of those games where A.J. Brown has 8 catches for 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. So I'd be starting both guys if you have A.J. Brown or if you have Smith in a different league. I think it's a very fantasy-friendly game on both sides. All right, let's move on to the smash starts section of the video. First guy up is Mr. Ladd McConkey. What a turnaround it's been for the second-year receiver. Everyone was calling him the number 3 option in this passing game behind Quentin Johnston and Keenan Allen. But let's be real. It's pretty evident at this point that Ladd is far and away the best receiver on this Chargers offense. Like, it's really not close. Congrats if you drafted Ladd, if you were patient with Ladd, if you traded for him, because he has been absolutely cooking as of late and is looking like the player that we saw the second half of last year from weeks 1 to 4. I get it. Ladd was the wide receiver 56 in fantasy, but since week 5, he's the wide receiver 4 in fantasy, averaging 17.5 fantasy points per game, and leads the Chargers in targets, receptions, yards, touchdowns. And Ladd is coming off one of his best performances in week 10, 4 receptions, 107 yards, touchdown, 6 targets, 20.7 fantasy points. And that route that he ran on that touchdown was absolutely filthy. The defensive back didn't even move. He didn't even have a chance. Ladd just double moved him and was gone. It was insane to watch. But that is McConkey. He's one of the best route runners already in this league, and he's become a must-start receiver at this point. He's looking like he's set up for another big game against the Jaguars, who have allowed the 13th most fantasy points to wide receivers this season. So yeah, you're obviously starting McConkey, but I'm just here to tell you that he's in for another big game. All right, moving on to our next guy, Jaylen Waddle, who's been one of the bright spots on this Miami offense as of late and has really stepped up since Tyreek Hill suffered that season-ending injury in week 4. Jaylen has been the clear-cut alpha wide receiver 1 on this offense and has accounted for over half of Miami's air yards since week 5. That is absolutely insane, along with ranking 3rd in yards per route run behind only Puka Nacua and Jackson Smith-Njigba. Waddle is also averaging 16 fantasy points per game since week 5. He's the wide receiver 14 over that span and is coming off another big game against Buffalo in week 10. 5 receptions, 84 yards, a touchdown on 7 targets, 19.4 fantasy points. I'm expecting Waddle to continue to eat on this Dolphins offense that's looked better as of late. Tua has looked better as of late. They've been pretty impressive in 2 of the last 3 games. They didn't look great against Baltimore. But I'd say the arrow is slightly pointing up for this offense, and they get a really easy matchup in Week 11 overseas against the Washington Commanders, who have allowed the most yards and 3rd most fantasy points per game to receivers this season. So I'd be expecting Waddle to go off yet again in this one. And last guy on this list is Davante Adams, who's shaping up to be one of the best picks in all of fantasy this year. as he's the wide receiver 8, averaging 17 fantasy points per game, and doing all that at the ripe age of 32 while playing alongside arguably the best receiver in football right now in Puka Nacua. Like, it's been impressive, but it doesn't surprise me. Adams, future Hall of Famer. He continues to play at a very high level. Age has not really been a factor. And a lot of Davante's success this year has come in the touchdown department. He has 9 touchdowns on the year, which is the most in the NFL. And that makes sense considering he ranks first in the NFL in red zone targets at 22. And he's already scored more touchdowns this year than he did in each of his last 2 seasons. Adams has been Matthew Stafford's favorite target when they get in close, and Davante has been on an absolute heater right now as he scored 19 plus fantasy points in each of his last 3 games. And it is worth noting that Davante is dealing with an oblique injury, but Sean McVay has already come out and said that he expects the veteran receiver to play this week, so that is good news. And I think he's going to have another monster performance in week 11. He's probably going to go over 100 receiving yards for the second time this year. Find the end zone. Big things yet again for the star receiver. All right, let's talk really briefly about 5 sleeper receivers that I love this week. Michael Wilson for the Cardinals with Marvin Harrison out. I think he steps up. Christian Watson for the Packers. They have a bunch of injuries on this offense. Romeo Doubs is expected to play, but Watson could have that big blow-up game that we've all been waiting for against the Giants, who do not have a good secondary. Tez Johnson. I don't know how Johnson is flying under the radar because he continues to score touchdowns, but people are still scared to start him. I would not be. I think this game between Buffalo and Tampa Bay is very high scoring. I also like Chimere DK for the Titans. Rookie receivers always tend to kind of emerge, break out the second half of the year. And Trey Tucker for the Raiders with no Jakobi Meyers on Monday Night Football against a really weak Dallas Cowboys secondary. I think he could quietly have a big game. That's all I have for you guys today. Really appreciate each and every one of you watching the video. You guys are all seriously the best. If you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.